Hello, welcome to Game Dev London. I'm Chris Payne, and today I have with me Dr. Rory Summerley, course leader of game design and development at London South Bank University. Welcome, Rory.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about your background, just to get them up to speed?
Yeah, sure. So, like you said, I'm the course leader for the game design and development course at LSVU, and what I do there is quite varied. My background is kind of in academia, so I did my PhD in game studies and research, and then progressed into sort of teaching on various games courses. So at LSBU, my main kind of role there is to organize the course. I also teach on the course, primarily on the sort of research side, but I also do a little bit of game design teaching. And I also have quite a lot of experience teaching and helping students work in teams. I also do, obviously, sort of my own research as part of working for a university, and there's 100 other small jobs you have to do as a as an academic,
Yeah,
mostly organizational and administrative. But the more interesting stuff tends to focus around the games themselves and research and that kind of stuff.
yeah. And teamwork is what we were going to discuss with the Global Game Jam coming at the end of the month. I thought it would be nice to chat about the process of putting a team together for a jam, or if you wanted to work solo. So, should we start at the small end?
Sure.
Let's talk about the pros and cons of doing a game jam entirely on your own.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, back when I did my master's in game design hundreds of years ago, we used to do game jams where I think primarily most people would do it solo. And that was partially just because there weren't that many of us doing it together. It'd be like, say, 10 or 12 of us in a small department. Um, but also partially just because we were kind of learning a bit of everything. So we weren't just exclusively programmers or designers or artists. We were kind of jacks of all trades, which I think
Yeah,
tends to work well if you are by yourself, if you feel like you are kind of a natural jack of all trade. But even then, you probably will have some strengths and weaknesses, which I guess is sometimes a weakness of doing anything solo. Some of the stuff you make is probably not going to be amazing, but that's just the nature of it, right? I mean, you've probably had experience, I'm imagining, of doing any kind of solo dev work as well.
yeah. I mean, I've done a fair few game jams, and because I spent a lot of my career in AAA studios, I quite enjoyed doing a solo thing where I could make all of the decisions myself.
Hmm.
Um, Flip side of that is that I had to do all of the work myself, and some of that work I wasn't really very good at. But you can, you can, I guess you can design around that. But yeah, you have to go into it understanding your own limitations, I guess, and knowing what you what you're able to tackle and um, what is going to prove to be difficult. I have tackled game jams where I went in deliberately thinking I'm going to model and rig a character because that is entirely outside my skill set, and I'm going to use this game jam to learn that skill.
Yeah.
Um, but then the game that ended up with was literally a really ugly character, poorly
Yeah.
animated, moving around a space, and little else.
Yeah, for
I,
sure. I mean, I've done similar on jams I've done as a solo developer way back when, where you kind of just use it as an opportunity to try something new. So in my case, I
yeah,
would usually just try and do a new genre, or something I hadn't really messed around with before. Like, I had never really had an interest in making it like shoot 'em ups or shmups before, but I had several game jams where my project naturally just became one of those. Partially due to time constraints, because the length of the jam obviously is a big factor.
yeah,
But yeah, we also, as an advantage of having fewer people in a strange way, some jams can sometimes run so that so like the global game jam has a
mm,
theme, right?
yeah.
But with some of the jams we used to run, you actually could assign every individual person a theme if it was small enough, which was quite interesting.
Oh,
As,
that's interesting.
yeah, we had a randomizer that would spit out like a sort of constraint or theme for every
Yeah,
person who was participating.
that could
Um,
create some interesting conflicting combinations.
Yeah, I think some people felt like they got some bad themes is one
Yeah,
of the downsides of that approach. But it was interesting though.
yeah. But that's the purpose of themes, really, isn't it? It's to like
Hmm.
mix it up and like force you to think about something that's not necessarily the most obvious
Yeah, absolutely.
thing to do.
I remember one time I got a theme which was Saint George and the Dragon, and had to
Mm-hmm.
create a game just based on that, no other prompt,
That
and that was fun.
yeah, that's cool. So that's that's one of the benefits of doing it all on your own. You can you get to make all the decisions and stretch your skills and so on. But there's something really nice about being able to sort of like agree on that. For example, that we're going to need sprites of St. George and a dragon,
Yeah,
and be able to just sort of like crack on with like making some gameplay while somebody else does the artwork that I can't do. Um, but of course, as soon as you like have like one other person in the mix, you need to make sure that you're on the same page.
mm.
So, and this is one of the key things that university is so good for, is forming teams and learning how to work with other people as well as just like understanding the technical skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the courses I've worked on, uh, generally speaking, team working is the advantage it brings, because most games courses and most learning resources really for games will teach you the usual stuff about how to use a given game engine,
Yeah.
or the basic principles of art or programming, coding, or even game design. But being able to actually practically work with others is an extremely tricky skill in some ways, but it's an
Mm.
extremely valuable skill. And it's worth doing, especially if you are interested in going into, say, industry, where you're very likely to have to do that if you want to make a living out of it. I mean, it's hard really to be a completely solo dev tool, I think. in From what I've sort of read and seen from people, it would be extremely hard not to be able to work with anyone else.
It is hard.
Yeah,
I have published a game that was sort of solo, but
mm,
I needed to get somebody else to help me with a bit of animation for it and a bit of
sure.
translation for it. And I needed to like buy in some music that I didn't compose. So even any game that is billed as a solo developer generally means that a solo full-time developer, but there will have been other people coming
Yeah,
in to do music, voices, the odd bit of artwork or something.
yeah, absolutely. There's always going to be a few people in the
Yeah,
background helping, which may not be as prominently credited in a lot of cases, but they are still there, and you still have to work with them,
yeah,
even if you're the sort of person doing the bulk of the work.
yeah. I think there are the occasional like rare examples of a solo developer working entirely on their own. I think Toby Fox might have made Undertale
He had a
completely
little bit of
unassisted.
assistance, I think.
Did
In
he?
Yeah, I think Temmie was another developer who worked
Oh
on the
yes.
project.
Sorry.
But but like you say, I mean, projects like that get known for there being like a sort of solo creator or
Yeah, yeah.
director. Um, I mean, he definitely did tons of work on the project, no doubt. But
Yeah, well, I know he did all the music as well, and I was just thinking,
yeah,
well, what's if he? I know he did sprites and he did music and he did the story and he did all the coding, and then like, well, what's that leave? It's
yeah, he's a very
um,
skilled developer, no doubt. Um,
yeah. Um, so, um, but yeah, so if you were looking to do something a little bit more ambitious that you couldn't manage on your own, um, and you were wanting to get some like other people's ideas on board as well. What is the optimal team size for, let's say, for the Global Game Jam to begin with, which is a week-long jam,
mhm.
on and off, not necessarily full-time? Um, how how many? What is there an optimal size?
I think it depends probably what you want to make and who you want to work with. I think you can definitely say there's probably an optimal limit, so that a
Mm,
team couldn't get ridiculously large, right? You couldn't have 2,000 person team working on a week-long project. But generally, I think in my experience, I've seen teams generally work pretty well when they're about like, say, 8 to 10 or under, maybe, because it's a bit less to have to manage. Because if you're doing a project for a week, you don't really have the capacity to start creating a very complex hierarchy of people on the project. You might have someone who's just helping to organize in a sort of producer role, but you wouldn't have, say, like multiple teams as such, in the sense of like having like 20 people on art and 20 people on design or something like that.
Yeah.
Just wouldn't really make sense for that kind of scale. But I find 8 to 10 generally tends to work quite well. But if you're already quite familiar with the people you're working with, smaller numbers can work very well, because you might be very practiced at kind of working together already. You don't have to kind of introduce yourselves and figure things out between you.
Yeah, that kind of experience working together brings a lot of benefits, which is why I guess why the games industry doesn't follow the movie industry's model of pulling together a team for a project, and then and then they all go their separate ways and maybe meet up on future projects and so on. In video games, we tend to like to try to keep the team together, because it's so incredibly collaborative. I think even more so than movies, possibly, because with movies, there's lots of people who have very, very sort of like discrete roles, and obviously they do need to. There is a certain amount of crosstalk, but with video games, the process of iterating means that there's a lot of things that all have to be perfect for it to work at all.
Yeah, and there's a lot of critical systems that could be developed over the sort of start to finish of a project,
Yeah.
which you might have one or two people kind of becoming knowledge silos for in some cases, where they're the person who was there when the project began. Say if it's like a multi-year development project, you might have new people come in who weren't there when, say a level was first made, and you're working on some revision of it. It helps to have the original level designer there. And it's not, like you say, it's not quite like movies where the different production phases can be extremely different in terms of the composition of people who are attached to the project. There might be people who are on it, say, 2/5 into it, who are just would never. You don't see them in the last final phase. They're done. They're finished. But yeah, it is interesting comparing them, though.
Yeah, I frequently try to compare them, but because they're just like two art forms that I'm particularly interested in. The video games, that process of iteration that does mean that you it really helps if the people that you are working with all understand each other, and you know what they can do, and you can just trust people to sort of like crack on with something. If you're putting together a fresh team, I guess there's a bit more of you've got to incorporate that learning curve of figuring out sort of like who can do what into the design process of design, coming up with a concept and then going, okay, so like, how are we going to build this? Who's going to do which parts? And figuring out what skills you have amongst the team.
Yeah, and on a jam, that first day is very quick, because it's also, okay, let's make something. What are we making? And then very rapidly after that, you have that conversation of like, who's going to be making what on this project, or it might even inform what you make, because you might say, oh, well, I've done X before, I could do this, or we can make this kind of game. Or maybe the team collaboratively decide, oh, we want to make something we've never done before. I want to try this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you have a bit of a negotiation rather than less typically you might have someone who's like, oh, I have a vision, let's make this.
Yes.
Because people aren't usually doing a jam just to be told what to do necessarily.
Yes.
They just want to kind of get together and have fun and enjoy the creative process for that reason.
How do you balance that? Because obviously the bigger the team gets, the more ideas are going to be floating around. and sometimes those ideas are going to be conflicting. How do you settle on what the vision is going to be? Obviously, you can start by brainstorming, but at some point, do you always have to sort of like have one person take charge of directing everything, or
Yeah, I mean,
is it?
it's a good question because I think a lot of, say, developers or even just groups sometimes naturally form a hierarchy around skills, or they might just do it because of traditional reasons, like, we've always done it this way, so we've got to keep doing it, apparently. But with Jam, I think the benefit is that the project is so short that you don't really have time to get too fussy about the details. And I think the
Yeah.
team kind of will naturally understand that because even if they've, say, never made a game before together, you don't have this sort of security of, oh, well, we don't have to decide everything right now. But you kind of do, at least at the initial stage, because otherwise, what are you doing with your with the time you have, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is a bit tricky though. I think sometimes people are quite naturally suited to organizational roles, which I think would be the ideal thing, rather than, say, a vision holder. I think if the process can be as democratic as possible, I think that generally works quite well.
Yeah.
But it is tricky to negotiate, especially if you've not worked together before, because then you have this additional skill on top of all of that, which is figuring each other out. And where
Yeah.
some people feel strong or might have a weakness in one area, or whether there's a kind of communication difference. Some people might be very shy to start with, for instance.
Yes.
So it's always good, I think, in the first day to kind of give everyone an opportunity to contribute to whatever ideas are being put out there.
Yeah.
But also, even though there is a time pressure, not to rush people through committing to something or saying, "Oh, well, we've heard your idea, let's move on,"
Yeah.
kind of thing.
I suppose one of the benefits of a game jam is that because it is very tight time frame,
Hmm.
uh, everybody's a little bit less invested in it and a little bit less precious about their own ideas,
Yeah, absolutely.
and more willing to compromise to just get something done in the very limited time frame that's available.
Yeah, for sure. Because from what I've seen as from the academic side, is whenever students do a long form game project as a team,
Hmm.
there are often quite a lot of difficulties, even just pinning down what they want to make in the first instance. So they might spend 3 or 4 weeks still in sort of the concept phase, which can
Ooh,
be quite frustrating for
yes.
everyone involved, I'm sure. Um, and you do get this preciousness of like, oh, I don't want to do this or that because I don't have those skills yet, and also I've got to make sure I get the best mark possible is another factor there. Whereas game jams are quite good for
Yeah.
kind of removing a lot of those barriers to just getting on with the thing and
Yeah.
not worrying too much about whether it's good or not. Because often a lot of the fun with game jams is that final day when you show everything off. Everyone usually gets a chance to kind of show things off in a smaller kind of locale or a site for a game jam like Global Game Jam.
Hmm.
And that's always really fun, partially because everyone understands the same constraints everyone else is working under. It's not like say, an assessment situation
Yeah.
or even like a pitch situation in industry where it's very, very serious
Yes. Yeah.
um,
And
and
you
you're
feel like
being,
you're being judged.
yeah, absolutely, and you're not given kind of a pass because the audience is different there. I think in a jam, you understand everyone is doing the same creative task, and
Yeah.
it's just interesting to see what people have done rather than say, "Oh, that could have been much better," or something like that. Um, but yeah, so I think it's got huge benefits, not just for education, but just generally as sort of a creative exercise.
Yeah. Well, I love it because having like coming from AAA, it it represents like a short game jam represents the entire development process that would normally take a couple of years squeezed down into a couple of days, um, and that includes like ideation, coming up with the concept and design, like making something work, iterating on it until it's fun, polishing it until it's uh, it's all reasonably clean, and then like finding all of the bugs, um, and all of the admin process of actually publishing it, and that brings with it having to like move into different roles over the course of the weekend, because obviously nobody joins a game jam going, I want to be the QA tester. But you still have to test it. So in my experience, you tend to get the same thing that you get in industry at a bigger scale, is where when people have like pretty much finished all of the creative work that they were doing on building the project, they switch to a QA role and they play it and they look for issues, and that's also really useful experience, because QA is unbelievably underrated.
Yeah, I mean, I have a module actually at LSView, and I've taught for a while on playtesting, kind of just as a dedicated aspect of research around games, which is also highly practical, obviously. But it is something that students in particular tend to leave by the wayside, I think, because they're more focused on the making of it than the seeing if it was any good or needs improvement. But yeah, playtesting's really good to do, but it's also quite hard. I think people are quite surprised sometimes when they have to do it, and then I'll give them feedback on their approach and say, well, if we're testing, you're testing. You ask sort of questions that might be misinterpreted by the tester, or you've maybe overlooked something because you're not being honest with yourself about if that is a big problem or not, particularly with not just like a bug that's usually fairly obvious, but like a big playability issue, like if it actually is fun for the player.
It's very hard to be objective about your own creation.
Yeah, exactly. And again, game jams, because they're shorter, I think allow you to have a bit more of a kind of distance from it, because you can think, I'll be done with this by next week. So let me really think about whether I need to be precious about how good this particular project is.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're not that invested in it, you can. It's easier to be honest and go, okay, well, our concept sucked, but can we salvage something from it?
Yeah. And also, you might say, I've got basically no time to decide whether or not I should and ah about it. Like you tend to be a bit more honest with yourself about what actually needs doing. Whereas I think on a months long or years long project, you can fall into a trap sometimes of like everyone on the in the team kind of just agrees that something isn't too big a problem until it becomes a huge problem later down the line.
Well, it's the scale of things, isn't it? If we've got months left on the project, that's plenty of time to fix this thing or that thing. And it is plenty of time to fix any one of those things.
Yes.
But if you have to try to fix all of those things, you don't have months. You actually only have a week or two. So
yeah. And also things can go wrong. You never know how a fix is going to manifest. But yeah, having that freedom of just being in a week or even a weekend just to play around with things, I think is very liberating for a lot of people when they do their first jam.
Yeah, that's cool. So what about structure then? Because the bigger your team gets, the harder it gets to get everybody on the same voice call, even if everybody's distributed. And the harder it gets to make sure that everybody understands exactly what they're supposed to be making. So at what point does it become useful to have not just like a vision holder, but maybe a producer who doesn't necessarily make anything, but he facilitates everybody else making the right things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's usually, in a jam context anyway, it's usually when you get to about 10 or more people. Because by that point, you probably have several groups of people who are all kind of groupable by their skill set. So you might have a couple of artists or a couple of programmers, maybe some miscellaneous people, like I say, a dedicated audio person or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the point at which you probably have at least 3 groups of people who are all working on very different aspects of the game. Like they are related, but they probably won't actually connect for quite a while. Or it might be more productive for, say, 3 artists to go away and decide art tasks amongst themselves alongside maybe a producer. I'd say probably 10 is where you want to start thinking about whether a producer is necessary. I don't think it's an absolute requirement in every case, but
Yeah.
I think it would be good because then you're thinking about listing out each person's tasks a bit more clearly. Whereas, say, with a team of 3, you can all sit in the same physical space and see the entire game's kind of task list together
Yeah.
and just quickly ask each other. Depending on the space you're working in, you might be working partially remotely with a larger team, and
Yeah.
you got to think about, what's our communication platform, for instance? Are we going to have a Discord
Yeah.
server where we post everything and update every hour or something like that, or as we finish things? It gets very tricky, but I do think it does depend on the game a little bit. Because I've seen larger teams, for instance, work on, say, like a visual novel over the course of a jam.
Yeah.
And you'll have, say, like a writer or maybe a couple of writers as a sort of writing team, maybe a designer programmer who's kind of figuring out how the thing works, and then you've got like 6 or 7 artists doing backgrounds and different characters and getting as much as they can kind of out. It's very different to say, like, if you were making, I don't know, like a 3D platformer, or even something quite unusual, like, say, a fighting game or something like that.
That's a great example because, as you say, like a visual novel is very art heavy, but the art doesn't change the gameplay significantly because that's more in the writing. Whereas with a fighting game, the size, the size and shape of the art and the speed that it animates can massively change the gameplay. So there's a lot.
Sorry, go on.
There's a lot greater demand for iteration on something like that, where multiple disciplines are interwoven.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a much bigger game balance task in that case. So you probably benefit from having multiple designers / programmers, and maybe a couple of artists just for doing character models and backgrounds. That'd be quite an ambitious one for a jam, I must admit.
It would, wouldn't it? Yeah.
But yeah, it would be interesting to try, though.
Yeah. So that brings, I mean, talking about the iteration process, that also brings up workflow, because ideally you want the artist to be able to go off and make a whole bunch of art that they can then bring back, and it just like slots into the game relatively easily, hopefully, unless something's gone wrong because of a miscommunication, for example.
Sure.
So are there any like techniques that help to split that off? Because the classic one in video games is like white boxing. So a designer would draft a level made out of white cubes, and like programmers would be working on mechanics in their own little like test level. And then the mechanics go into the white box level, and then the artists look at that white box level and go, okay, now I'll make it pretty. It's all an effort to try to separate the disciplines a little bit so that they can get on with their particular task without having to wait on the other disciplines.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're condensing quite a complex development process into a very small time period.
Yeah.
Naturally, you'll lose some opportunities for detail. So, like,
yeah,
if you're working on a long-form project, you might subscribe to some sort of method, like, say, Agile or Scrum, where you are having stand-ups at a regular period of time. I imagine if you're doing a week-long jam, you'd probably naturally have a check-in every day. Hoping that you're not working 24 hours a day or anything. But you would naturally check in with each other if you were working on a project for a week together. But the way in which you check in, I guess, is important because you want to make sure that everyone knows what they're doing. Everyone can work somewhat independently. But there is still sort of a general plan. I would probably say that, again, that first day is the crucial time to decide a lot of things and also ask a lot of questions. I think sometimes people, especially when concepting, feel a little like they don't want to rock the boat by asking questions just to clarify things. Like, are we making 2 levels really, or are we making a boss fight? Is a boss fight its own level? Those kinds of really what seem to be kind of boring clarifications are really essential to avoid mistakes later on, I think. So And I think that's what a stand-up traditionally allows, is just an opportunity for everyone to say, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, and then everyone else can say, I think I understand what you're doing, let me just double check that, and that means that I will do this in response, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's got to be a back and forth, whatever it is.
Yeah.
It can't just be here's the plan, go do, and then everyone goes and does, and it turns out they didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, it's creating opportunities for course correction, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So if it was a 48-hour jam, then like check-in once a day is it's not enough, because if you can spend all day making a bunch of artwork and then like the following day you meet up and find that they were expecting you to do it completely differently, you need to kind of like have some sort of like almost like a scrum every hour or two, when with a single task to get done, and go, here's one sprite, boom, there you go. Is it the right size, shape, color?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to build it, is to have more rapid kind of opportunities for reflection. Because obviously throughout the day you're going to get hungry and people will want to have snacks, or maybe just want to stretch their legs, take comfort breaks and things. There might be natural points in the day where you can all just say, hey, let's check in with each other very quickly. But I'm probably making this sound very formal. I think one of the advantages of the game jam is it can be very playful as well. Like people can just kind of bounce ideas around. You might just come up with something on the spot, and say to the team, hey, I just thought of this. Shall I put it in? Shall I make our main character, like, I don't know, a man made of tennis balls or something?
Yeah.
Something strange or random like that.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, yeah, that sounds great. So you don't have to belabor every decision.
Yeah.
A lot of it can be quite playful.
I mean, that can work really well. I mean, I did a Scrum training course at AAA, which the whole course happened within one day, and so what we were actually doing was like building Lego models, and we were given a brief, and then we were given like 10 minutes to make a model and present them to the client who was running the course, and he would ask for like a fire station with a fire engine, and then like our team would have to split that up and go sort of like, okay, who's going to build the building, who's going to build the vehicle, and then like you'd present something to him after 10 minutes, and then he'd say sort of like, oh, I didn't want the fire station red, I wanted it blue. And he'd just throw spanners in the works so that that we had to course correct and stuff. And with like just something as simple as making Lego models, it was noisy and chaotic and extremely fun, but it was a really good representation of the process of splitting up tasks, getting a little bit done, checking in and to see if everything was going heading in the right direction, or whether it needed changing, and then repeating.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that's something that is kind of a lesson that you take with you in any kind of team working projects, like even things that aren't even to do with games, like you say with the Lego example. There's all sorts of teamwork skills you get from that apply everywhere. Working with other people is constant kind of communication and clarification.
It is, yeah.
So yeah, it's extremely valuable. Coming back to the scale question, I was just thinking that the size of the team is interesting, because I mentioned earlier that you can sometimes have sort of a limit in terms of like optimization.
Yeah.
And in my experience with students, even with long form projects, you sometimes see people start to struggle when they reach teams of about like 12 to 15 or more.
Yeah.
Where you might have people who are not as experienced in terms of communication skills really struggle. And it starts to sort of break down. And usually, strangely, the pattern I've observed is the teams often split into two teams first, sort of in an informal way. And then formally, they will actually just split, because half the team wanted to go with one idea, and half the team wanted to do another idea. And splitting is not a bad thing, really, in that case. It's just that I think sometimes you get very ambitious teams thinking, oh, we've got enough of the right people, we can take on the world, we'll make an open world MMO in a week or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just reminded me of the scale issue when you're talking about
Yeah.
sort of agile and things like that.
It's a good point, because you talked earlier about like splitting the team up by discipline,
Yeah,
and something that in my experience with AAA, where we had like a couple of hundred people working on a project, even splitting it up by discipline wasn't necessarily enough, because you would still, it wasn't just enough to go like, oh, all programmers and all the artists, because that was still far too many people, and so we would start to get grouped into small teams by remit. So, for example, within programming, we would have a team of um, gameplay programmers who were basically responsible for implementing the design as written. But then there would also be like gameplay systems programmers who were responsible for anything that was a repeatable mechanic that was going to get reused.
right.
For example, so let's pick a Spider-Man game as an example.
Hmm.
I've never worked on one, but
Sure.
so gameplay systems would be sort of like making the web slinging work, and navigating the city, and also like combat, and then the gameplay programmers would be responsible for setting up the specific like missions and who you have to fight and what you have to do to beat them and what special considerations do you have. Is this a boss fight where there's like something unusual about it, and that breaking the like team into smaller, basically that figure that you gave of about a dozen people, we did find was like the biggest team you could manage before it started to get unwieldy.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. It's been fairly consistent, at least for creative
Mm.
projects that I've seen, where communication has to be very strictly controlled, which is not everyone's favorite thing anyway. Otherwise, it does just break down. I mean, I saw, speaking of kind of how you divide by disciplines, I don't know if you've seen the documentary Psych Odyssey about Double Fine Studios.
I have not. No.
It's a really
I'll have a
amazing
look for it.
documentary, regardless if you're interested in game development. But
Yeah.
basically, Double Fine kind of brought in a team to film them creating Psychonauts 2 from start to
Right.
finish over a period of about 5 years. It's a really interesting sort of fly on the wall documentary because you get to see a lot of things that you don't usually hear about, like when things go wrong, for instance. And you get
Yeah.
to see it happening kind of in real time and people reflecting on it over time. It's a really good series. It's free on YouTube. There's about 30 episodes.
I will definitely look that up. I watched some of the documentary stuff that they did for Double Fine Adventure, which became Broken Age.
Yes, yeah, they worked on that as well.
Yeah.
So this is like a much larger, more
Yeah.
all-encompassing version of that. I recommend it to anyone who's obviously interested in game development because you get a lot of insight into how things practically go wrong in a real studio.
Yes.
Also go right. But one of the problems they sometimes encountered was dividing teams and also trying to impose hierarchies where they might not have worked so well. Because obviously hierarchies come about often because people feel there is a need to organize things, and particularly when there's a financial stake, I guess it helps to have that. And it does help to have people plan and organize things who can see things from above. But it can also lead to problems where you arbitrarily group people together who you think should be, say, like in an artist's subgroup or something, but they might have ideas and other things they could offer in, say, design.
Yeah.
It's a lot of ways in which people's skills might overlap. So it doesn't always make sense to divide by discipline. I think it tends to work when people have the opportunity to work freely with each other, but broadly speaking, do have a discipline that they can be consulted on for expertise or given a larger task to kind of have responsibility for. But this, we're talking about organizational skills and processes that are very hard to master.
Yeah.
It's very difficult.
That's absolutely right. I mean, one of from working at TT Games with hundreds of people, communication was a constant problem of trying to make sure that everybody who needed to know knew about something, but not everybody was constantly bombarded with information all of the time. There's a sweet spot in between those two extremes that it's a constant struggle to keep hitting it, and there's constant sort of like going to producers complaining that sort of like, why wasn't I invited to this meeting, because I could have told you that this would be a problem 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
And now I've got to solve it. And I don't think that there is a magic solution to that. It's just trying to sort of like, I guess, allowing people to opt into as much communication as they can handle.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's definitely not a one size fits all solution.
No.
But I've seen this with students, but also actually in sort of academic organization, because I'm having, as a course leader, I have to organize various things and talk to various staff members in different departments to arrange various things. And I find that kind of a mixture of a targeted real-time communication, say like a live message chat, and sort of a more asynchronous thing like email or some sort of internal messaging system for bigger announcements tends to work. But even then, you find even single individuals work very differently and have very different preferences about what time of day they answer emails, what time of day they actually check any kind of messages, or if the people are co-located. So if they work physically in the same room, they might chat idly about stuff. Like I often say to people, I learnt more about working in academia being in a staff kitchen than anywhere else, because people just happened to bring up stuff while we were getting a tea and just thinking through a problem or something, rather than from like endless meetings that we have every week where everyone's like, oh, and this week we're doing this, and you probably sometimes feel like we didn't really need to have the meeting.
There is there is a certain amount of value from sort of like encountering other team members randomly in the kitchen.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
and just sort of like, it's a little bit of a random way to facilitate communication, though.
It's not something I'd want to rely on.
No.
But it's something I noticed happened in COVID during lockdown, because we all obviously had to pivot to working remote. We found that new staff who joined us at the time kind of had a training gap because we couldn't just explain something quickly in the office or in the kitchen or whatever. And it revealed huge problems in terms of like, how does the institution, for instance, organize the training and kind of norms that you would just get from naturally working together in the same space.
See. So it revealed things that were sort of like not formally communicated, but they were just picked up by virtue of people being in the same space.
Exactly. And you don't really realize that until you are suddenly forced to work from home for years. But it was really revelatory, because now everyone's still, depending on where they work, sometimes will have quite a significant amount of work from home and in person. And covering your bases is very tricky. It's another consideration for game jams, actually, because you might have half the team decide, oh, it's just a bit more convenient for me to work remotely, if that's okay. So you want to make sure everyone's kept on the same page, even if some of you are working together in the same space and some of you might be, on the other side of the planet, maybe.
That is a real challenge, actually, mixing remote workers with on-site workers. Again, something TT struggled with when they were like long before COVID. When I was on paternity leave, I did a bit of working from home, and it was very difficult. I felt very out of the loop because everybody else was in the office. So that was a bit weird. Since then, of course, even before COVID, I started like running my studio fully remotely, and so everybody's remote, and you can only ever talk to each other when you get on a video call, and that puts everybody on the same footing, which is fine, and it leads to like a greater usage of chat applications and so forth. But there's, I guess, in terms of a game jam, it's whatever whatever works for you, because it's not something that you have to sustain for a very long time. So
Yeah, and again, you can make mistakes in a slightly lesser risky environment.
yeah,
Like you don't have the stakes really.
yeah,
So it's good for that because I think now that well, quite a lot of people have to work kind of in a hybrid fashion or may have to.
yeah,
There's a lot more skills and things you have to be sort of competent with. You have to, like, I come across people in my work who don't know what Discord is, for instance, or
yeah,
other people who might not be familiar with, say, something like Microsoft Teams. And I work with a lot of different platforms because a lot of people prefer different things. So I'm all over the place. But yeah, it's tricky. It's a lot more you have to get better at, even though it seems more convenient on the face of it that you can just have a meeting anywhere. So yeah,
that's a very good point. Actually, it's a good opportunity to like get familiar with different communications tools that you might not have tried before,
mm.
um, or Scrum planning tools and websites and stuff like that.
Yeah, because I used to recommend students use things like Trello
Yeah,
or even Miro, um, and I think that's become more and more relevant if you're doing, say, hybrid or remote working, where you kind of, like, say, in an office, you might have a whiteboard or something that's shared, where people
yeah,
just put up little silly post-its and things. But um, a really big problem in lockdown was trying to figure out a way to simulate that same creative process in a
yeah,
way that doesn't feel detached and does feel
yeah,
like a shared space. Um, so things like, I mean, a lot of people started to rely on Discord, but I think things that have a kind of visual organizational element to them, like say a Trello or a Miro,
yeah,
become very useful as well. And you tend to rely on many different tools, not necessarily just one.
yeah. Yeah, even in a big developer, we would if we were in like the final push to just sort of like get a build complete and sort of like sent off for a milestone, we would abandon all of the more sophisticated tools and just end up with like one of the leads maintaining a Google Doc with a whole bunch of like just like what one task per line and just like striking them off and moving them to the top
Right.
as they got done, so we could see exactly just a simple representation of what was left to do, um, because it didn't need all of the peripheral kind of you know being able to I guess it was most important for it to be a frictionless process of tracking this stuff, and sort of
Yeah.
like even the tiniest amount of friction of having to go in and sort of like assign this task to this person and like set the priority of this task and so on. It's just sort of like dragging and dropping lines of text in a document. It's just that tiny reduction of friction made it so much easier. It
Yeah.
also, yeah, it also changed the energy in within the team. Um, just having this like little bullet point list that was like gradually getting smaller, and then somebody would find a new problem, and it would get bigger again. But we'd gradually get it smaller, and it'd be down to sort of like, oh, there's one last thing to fix, and then like maybe like two or three people would all jump on trying to fix the same bug.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's getting into that flow because, like, I don't really think it matters what tools you end up
Yeah,
with, say, in game development in terms of how you're managing the process. But as long as everyone can access it, learn it, and the tool kind of fits the job broadly. Like I use Excel a lot. Like Excel is extremely versatile. You don't really need much more often than like a table or a list in a lot of cases if you're just trying to
yeah,
organize things. You don't need, say, a fancy thing. Like I've heard great things about tools like Jira, for instance, and I'm sure they're amazing for organization. But you can get things done with whatever you have to hand. I mean, like
yeah.
ages ago, you would have had to do all this stuff on pen and paper before you necessarily
Yeah,
would
exactly. Yeah,
put everything on the computer.
I can barely believe we got anything done without computers.
Yeah, or the internet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, on that note, do you have any kind of sort of like final advice for people putting together a team in terms of you know, who to choose to work with, and how to go about it?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I imagine a lot of people preparing to do a jam might have some friends or people they already know who they want to work with, and I think that's great. I think taking a chance on people you've not worked with before can be quite fruitful because you never know, especially if you've never met the person before. You never know what they might offer in
Yeah.
terms of either what they could bring to the project or just a connection you could make. Because likelihood is a lot of the people doing a game jam, sort of in the area that you're in, might eventually end up being, they could be a friend, they could be a colleague, they could just be a fellow in the games industry. There's all sorts of benefits to just opening up to new opportunities, but I don't think you should necessarily shy away from just wanting to work with your friends on something. Either way, I mean, these are very short-term projects, so you're always going to have opportunities to do more jams. There's jams always going on somewhere throughout the year. So
Yeah.
I'd say if anyone's new to doing a jam, just don't worry about it really in terms of who you're working with. I'd say try and work in a team before working on your own, just to get that experience, because I think that's probably the most useful thing you'd get out of it.
I guess any whatever approach you take, you're going to come out of a jam with a whole load of experience of either working with strangers, working with friends, working on your own, and tackling a whole bunch of problems that you might have taken months to stumble across in a more commercial game development scenario.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah, I mean, you never know what's going to happen, so just be open to anything happening. Don't go in with too many preconceptions about what you want to make, because I think I've seen this sometimes where people will come to a jam and they'll be like, "Oh, I have an idea of what I'm going to do," and it's like, "Well, we don't even know the theme yet. Are you just going to sort of crowbar in what you were going to make anyway?"
I would never do that. I would never come to a jam with a great idea and try to bend the theme to fit it.
Yeah, it led to some really funny results because some people ended up making games that had almost nothing to do with the theme and just had a sort of tokenistic object related to the theme somewhere in the game.
But that's okay too.
Yeah. I mean, it was very funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would just go in, try and keep an open mind. Just like you never know, it's going to be a lot more improvisational than a more long form game development project. So I'd lean into that if you can.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much, Rory. Where can people find you if they want to learn a bit more about your course at London South Bank?
Well, I don't really have much social media. I am on LinkedIn, I guess, if you want to search me up and add me there. But to find out about the course, I would recommend just going on the LSBU website. See if I can find the actual URL. But we also have socials. We try to get our games trending on Twitter often by getting students to link whatever they've kind of been making. I believe the hashtag is #LSBU Games. So check that out, as well as our website, lsbu.ac.uk. If you're thinking of doing a course in game development, you can just sign up to one of our open days if you want to come by and see what we offer. But yeah, if you want to see what our students are making, just search up LSBU on Twitter. We should see a lot of what our students are making there, hopefully.
Wonderful. And if you want to hear more interviews like this, pop along to gamedev.london, where you can find the rest of our podcasts and links to our Discord, where people chat about all things game dev. Until next week, thanks very much. Thank you, Rory.
Thanks.